October 25, 1944, 6:48 a.m., Philippine Sea off Samar Island, Ensign William C. Brooks stood in the pilot house of the destroyer escort USS Samuel B. Roberts, coffee cup frozen halfway to his lips. Through the grey dawn mist, impossible silhouettes were materializing on the northern horizon. Pagoda masts, the distinctive profiles of Japanese battleships. His hand trembled slightly as he reached for the voice tube, his words about to trigger the most one-sided naval engagement in modern warfare. Except the Americans didn't know they were supposed to lose. Bridge, combat, multiple surface contacts bearing 350, range 30,000 yards, classification. His voice caught, battleships, cruisers, Christ, it's the whole Japanese fleet. What happened in the next 2 hours and 47 minutes would defy every principle of naval tactics, shock Japanese admirals who had never known defeat, and prove that courage could, just once, overcome mathematics itself. This is the story of the Battle off Samar, where 450 American sailors charged the most powerful naval force ever assembled, knowing they couldn't win but attacking anyway. The late Gulf operation represented the largest naval battle in human history. 4 separate engagements spread across 100,000 square miles of Philippine waters. By October 24, 1944, American forces had successfully landed 130,000 troops on Leyte Island, establishing the beachhead that would return Douglas MacArthur to the Philippines. The Japanese response was Operation Go Victory Operation, a desperate, all-or-nothing gamble to destroy the American invasion fleet. Admiral Somu Toyoda's plan was elegant in its simplicity and devastating in its execution. 3 separate Japanese naval forces would converge on Leyte Gulf simultaneously, catching the American fleet in a perfectly coordinated trap. The southern force under Admiral Shoji Nishimura would transit through Surigao Strait from the south. The northern force under Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa, built around Japan's 4 remaining aircraft carriers, would approach from the northeast as a deliberate sacrifice, drawing away Admiral William Halsey's powerful Third Fleet with its fast battleships and fleet carriers. And then, with Halsey's forces pulled out of position, the center force would strike. Admiral Takeo Kurita commanded the most powerful surface action group Japan had ever assembled. His force included 4 battleships, Yamato, Musashi, Nagato, and Kongo, mounting guns so large their 18.1-inch shells weighed 3,200 pounds each. 6 heavy cruisers added another layer of overwhelming firepower. 2 light cruisers and 11 destroyers completed what Japanese planners called the unstoppable spear. The mathematics were simple. If Kurita's center force could reach the vulnerable transport ships anchored in Leyte Gulf, American losses would exceed Pearl Harbor. The invasion would collapse, the war might drag on for years, but Kurita had to transit San Bernardino Strait, a narrow passage between Samar and Luzon Islands, to reach his objective. On October 24th, American submarines and aircraft had savaged Kurita's fleet as it crossed the Sibuyan Sea. The super battleship Musashi, sister ship to Yamato and considered unsinkable, absorbed 19 torpedo hits and 17 bomb strikes before capsizing with 1,023 men trapped inside. The heavy cruiser Myoko limped away with torpedo damage. American pilots reported the entire center force turning back, apparently defeated. Admiral Halsey received these reports aboard his flagship New Jersey and made what historians would debate for decades. He assumed Kurita was finished. When search planes spotted Ozawa's carrier force to the north, Halsey saw the opportunity to destroy Japanese naval aviation once and for all. He took everything, all 6 fleet carriers, all 8 fast battleships, all his cruisers and destroyers, and raced northward, leaving San Bernardino Strait completely unguarded. Halsey's chief of staff, Rear Admiral Robert Carney, later admitted, "We thought we'd crippled Kurita. We thought we'd won. They were wrong. At 9:30 p.m. on October 24th, Kurita's battered but still formidable force reversed course." The admiral's determination was unshaken despite losing Musashi and despite the relentless American air attacks. He would complete his mission or die trying. His fleet increased speed to 20 knots and headed directly for San Bernardino Strait. No American forces were positioned to stop him. Unknown to Halsey, unknown to Kurita, and certainly unknown to the men who would face each other at dawn, the only obstacle between the Japanese center force and the defenseless transport ships was Taffy 3, Rear Admiral Clifton Sprague's escort carrier group. Taffy 3 was never designed for surface combat. Its 6 escort carriers, Fanshawe Bay, St. Lo, White Plains, Kalanin Bay, Kitcon Bay, and Gambia Bay, were converted merchant hulls with maximum speeds of 17 knots and flight decks protected by quarter-inch steel plating. Their primary weapons were the FM-2 Wildcat fighters and TBM Avenger torpedo bombers they carried, useful for submarine patrol and ground support, but barely adequate against armored warships. The screen protecting these carriers consisted of 3 destroyers USS Johnston, Hoel, and Heermann, and 4 destroyer escorts, Dennis, John C., Butler, Raymond, and Samuel B. Roberts. These small warships mounted Vinch guns that could dent Japanese armor at close range, but would shatter against battleship plating at anything beyond suicidal distances. Their torpedoes offered the only realistic threat, but using them meant closing to 10,000 yards, point-blank range where Japanese secondary batteries would annihilate them. The force imbalance was staggering. Kurita's 4 battleships displaced 181,000 tons and mounted 41 major caliber guns. Sprague's entire task group displaced 38,000 tons. Kurita's fleet could steam at 28 knots. Sprague's carriers managed 17 knots with a following wind. The Japanese had 10,500 sailors. Taffy 3 had 4,200. More importantly, doctrine and training had prepared Clifton Sprague for submarine threats and air attacks, not surface engagement with battleships. His emergency plans called for air strikes and retreat, not ship-to-ship combat. His escorts had enough fuel for perhaps 3 hours of high-speed maneuvering. His ammunition magazines held enough shells for perhaps 30 minutes of sustained fire. Admiral Sprague, known throughout the fleet as Ziggy, was a 48-year-old career officer from Indiana who had earned his wings in 1921 and commanded carriers throughout the Pacific campaign. He was cautious, methodical, and entirely unprepared for what was about to emerge from the morning mist. Neither was Takeo Kurita, who was about to encounter the only force in military history that would charge battleships with destroyers, and somehow survive. At 6:37 a.m., Ensign Hans Jensen was flying anti-submarine patrol from the escort carrier St. Lo when he spotted what he initially dismissed as rain squalls on the northern horizon. The distinctive wakes caught his attention, long, parallel lines of white water characteristic of surface ships moving at high speed. His radio call was almost casual. Taffy 3, I've got surface ships bearing 3-4s, aero, maybe cruisers or something. Aboard Fanshawe Bay, Admiral Sprague's flagship, radar operators had detected the contacts 15 minutes earlier, but classified them as friendly units. Halsey's battleships returning from the north, perhaps, or Admiral Oldendorf's force coming up from Surigao Strait, where they'd annihilated the Japanese southern force during the night. At 6:45 a.m., lookouts aboard the destroyer Johnston reported visual contact with what appeared to be the massive superstructures of capital ships. Lieutenant Commander Robert Hagan, the ship's gunnery officer, trained his optical rangefinder on the lead vessel and felt his stomach drop. That's not friendly, he announced quietly. Pagoda mast, Japanese configuration, range 30, 2,000 yards and closing. On Johnston's bridge, Commander Ernest Evans, the ship's commanding officer and a Cherokee warrior who wore his combat helmet with the inscription, "Ain't no such thing as halfway loyalty," grabbed his binoculars and confirmed what his gunners were seeing. "That's Congo-class battleship," Evans stated flatly, "and there's more behind her. Sound General Quarters." At 6:46 a.m., Admiral Sprague received the first identification. Large Japanese fleet bearing 015, distance 20 miles, closing at 25 knots. Sprague's first response was disbelief bordering on anger. "That's impossible. Halsey has every major Japanese unit under surveillance." His operations officer, Commander Richard Ballinger, was already correlating radar plots with visual sightings. "Admiral, we're seeing 4 large capital ships, at least 6 cruisers, and numerous destroyer escorts. They're in battle formation and they're heading directly toward us." Clifton Sprague understood instantly. San Bernardino Strait was unguarded. Kurita had come through during the night. Halsey was 300 miles to the north, too far to help, and Taffy 3, with its converted merchant carriers and thin-skinned escorts, was the only thing standing between the Japanese center force and the transport ships anchored in Leyte Gulf. At 6:48 a.m., Yamato's forward rangefinders acquired targets. The battleship's massive 18.1-inch guns elevated to 30 degrees, maximum range. Fire control computers calculated trajectory, windage, and target speed. At 6:58 a.m., Yamato fired the first salvo. The sound was beyond description, a physical pressure wave that rippled across 15 miles of ocean. 9 shells, each weighing 3,200 pounds, arced upward at 2,850 feet per second, climbing to 35,000 feet before descending toward Taffy 3's formation. Aboard White Plains, Signalman First Class Harold Falgout watched the salvo in flight, mesmerized by the sight of shells large enough to see with the naked eye as they reached apex and began their terminal descent. They looked like flying telephone poles. He later recalled, "You could see them tumbling end over end, and then you realized they were aimed at us." The first salvo landed 200 yards short of White Plains, throwing up geysers of water that dwarfed the escort carrier. The dye markers, bright red from Yamato's shells, confirmed what everyone already knew. This was no mistake, no friendly fire incident. The Japanese were shooting to kill, and their gunnery was terrifyingly accurate. At 6:59 a.m., Admiral Sprague issued his first orders, his voice steady despite the circumstances. "All units flank speed, make smoke. Execute emergency turn to the east. Launch all aircraft." The carriers heeled into the turn, their thin-skinned hulls vibrating as their engines pushed beyond rated capacity. 17 knots became 18, then 19 as engineering crews bypassed safety systems and pushed boiler pressures into the red zones. Behind the carriers, the destroyers and destroyer escorts increased speed to 30 knots, positioning themselves between the carriers and the oncoming Japanese force. Every ship began laying smoke, oil, fed chemical generators pouring out thick white clouds that merged with the natural morning mist to create an artificial fog bank. Within minutes, Taffy 3 disappeared into a grey curtain, but the Japanese had already locked in their firing solutions. Shells continued to fall with methodical precision. Kongo, Nagato, and Haruna added their 14-inch and 16-inch batteries to Yamato's fire. The heavy cruisers, Haguro, Chokai, Kumano, Suzuya, Chikuma, and To, opened up with their 8-inch guns. The volume of fire was incomprehensible. By 7:05 a.m., Japanese ships were launching over 200 shells per minute into the area where Taffy 3's carriers were running for their lives. Near, missiles threw up water columns that crashed down on flight decks like waterfalls. The concussion alone was enough to injure men standing on exposed decks. Aboard Kalanan Bay, Captain Thomas Williamson watched a 14-inch shell penetrate his flight deck, pass through the hangar bay without exploding, exit through the ship's side plating, and detonate in the water 20 feet from the hull. The blast opened seams below the waterline. Seawater poured into engineering spaces. The carrier's speed dropped to 16 knots, then 15. "We're falling behind the formation," Williamson reported to Admiral Sprague. "Taking heavy fire, request permission to maintain station." Negative, Sprague responded immediately, "Maintain maximum speed, zigzag pattern, stay in the smoke." But the smoke couldn't hide them completely. Japanese optical rangefinders were sophisticated instruments, and their crews were the best trained gunners in the world. At 7:10 a.m., Gambier Bay took her first hit, an 8-inch shell from the heavy cruiser Chikuma that penetrated the engine room and killed 14 men instantly. The situation was deteriorating with mathematical precision. The Japanese fleet was making 25 knots. The American carriers were making 17 knots. The range was closing at 8 knots, 480 yards per minute. In 30 minutes, Japanese cruisers would be close enough to use their secondary batteries. In 45 minutes, they'd be shooting point blank. Admiral Sprague had launched every available aircraft, nearly 100 Wildcats and Avengers, but they were armed for ground support missions, not naval combat. Most carried depth charges or high-explosive bombs, neither particularly effective against armored warships. The pilots would do what they could, but without armor, piercing bombs or proper torpedoes, their attacks would be more harassment than destruction, which left only one option. At 7:16 a.m., Admiral Sprague transmitted the order that would define the battle: "Small boys attack." "Small boys" was the nickname for destroyers and destroyer escorts, the expendable screen whose mission was to sacrifice themselves if necessary to save the carriers. Commander Ernest Evans on Johnston didn't wait for confirmation. He'd already positioned his ship for attack. Commander Ernest E. Evans was 42 years old, a decorated veteran of multiple Pacific campaigns, and absolutely certain he was about to die. He'd made peace with that reality the moment he'd spotted Japanese battleships on the horizon. Johnston was a Fletcher-class destroyer, one of the finest warships ever built by American shipyards. She displaced 2,100 tons, mounted 5 5-inch guns in single turrets, and carried 10 21-inch torpedo tubes. Her crew of 327 men had trained together for 18 months, drilling relentlessly on gunnery and torpedo attacks until they could reload and fire faster than any other destroyer in the fleet. But training couldn't change physics. Johnston's 5-inch guns had a maximum range of 18,000 yards. The Japanese heavy cruisers closing on Taffy 3 had 8-inch guns with 30,000-yard range. To launch torpedoes, Johnston's only meaningful weapons, Evans would need to close to 10,000 yards, inside the range where Japanese secondary batteries could tear his ship apart. The mathematics were brutal. To reach firing position, Johnston would need to cover 22,000 yards under direct fire from at least 6 enemy cruisers. At 30 knots, that would take approximately 8 minutes. 8 minutes during which Johnston would be alone, unsupported, and targeted by every Japanese ship with a firing solution. Evans issued his orders at 7:18 a.m. All ahead flank. Prepare for torpedo attack. All guns commence firing at maximum range. Johnston heeled into a turn, her bow swinging toward the advancing Japanese fleet. Black smoke poured from her stacks as her boilers pushed output beyond design limits. Her wake became a churning white fountain as her screws bit into the Pacific, accelerating the destroyer to 32 knots, faster than she'd ever gone in trials. At 7:20 a.m., at maximum range of 18,000 yards, Johnston opened fire. Her 5-inch guns began a drumbeat that would continue without pause for the next 43 minutes. The forward 2 guns, mounts 51 and 52, targeted the lead heavy cruiser, which Johnston's identification team had correctly classified as Kimono. The aft guns targeted Suzuya, second in the cruiser column. The shells were too small to penetrate heavy cruiser armor at this range, but that wasn't Evans' goal. He was trying to distract the Japanese gunners, to force them to split their attention between the vulnerable carriers and this crazy destroyer charging straight at them. It worked. At 7:22 a.m., Kimono's forward turrets swung toward Johnston and fired. Eight 8-inch shells weighing 260 pounds each screamed toward the destroyer at 2,800 feet per second. Lieutenant Commander Robert Hagan, tracking the incoming salvo through his optical rangefinder, watched the shells arc downward and shouted the warning, "Incoming 15 seconds." Evans spun the wheel hard to starboard. Johnston heeled 30 degrees, her keel cutting a tight turn that threw men against bulkheads. The salvo landed exactly where Johnston would have been a perfect straddle that would have destroyed the ship instantly if Evans hadn't turned. But now Kumano's fire control had Johnston's speed and heading. The next salvo would compensate for the turn. At 7:24 a.m., Johnston took her first hit. An 8-inch shell struck the base of the forward smokestack at a shallow angle, penetrating the thin plating and detonating inside the uptake. The explosion destroyed ventilation to the forward boiler room and killed 11 men in the fire control crew. Shrapnel severed hydraulic lines to the forward gun director. Mount 52 lost power and switched to local control. Commander Evans felt the hit as a shudder through the deck plates. Damage reports flooded the bridge. Fire amidships, casualties in fire control, forward director offline. "Keep firing," Evans ordered. "We're not out of the fight yet." At 7:27 a.m., Johnston crossed into torpedo range, 10,000 yards from Kumano. Evans steadied the ship on her attack heading, giving his torpedo crews a stable platform for final calculations. Torpedo solution locked. Lieutenant John Steinberg reported from plot. "Recommend firing sequence. Fire all torpedoes," Evans commanded. Johnston's 10 21-inch torpedo tubes launched in sequence. Each Mark 15 torpedo dropping into the water with a splash before its engine ignited and drove it toward the target at 46 knots. The torpedoes spread in a fan pattern, creating a 1,200-yard spread that would be almost impossible for Kumano to avoid. The running time at 10,000 yards was 4 minutes and 30 seconds. Evans kept Johnston at flank speed, zigzagging violently to avoid the increasing volume of fire as more Japanese ships acquired his position. At 7:28 a.m., a 14-inch shell from Battleship Congo, joining the engagement with its enormous 36,000-yard guns, struck Johnston's stern. The shell was so large and moving so fast that it punched completely through the destroyer without detonating, entering through the port side aft of the aft deckhouse, transiting the entire width of the ship, and exiting through the starboard side before exploding in the water beyond. The hole it left was 6 feet in diameter. Seawater flooded the after steering compartment. Johnston lost steering control from the bridge and switched to manual steering from aft steering, a backup position deep in the ship where sailors turned the rudder with a manual wheel, responding to orders passed by sound, powered telephone. At 7:29 a.m., another 8-inch shell struck Johnston's port side at the waterline, penetrating the hull and detonating in the forward engine room. The explosion killed 23 men instantly, destroyed the port turbine, and ruptured steam lines. Superheated steam at 600 pounds per square inch filled the engineering space. The few survivors staggered out through the escape trunk, their skin hanging in sheets from steam burns. Johnston's speed dropped from 32 knots to 27 knots. Then 24 knots. Then 20 knots as the surviving engineering crew shut down damaged systems and rerouted power. But Evans had achieved his goal. At 7:31 a.m. and 40 seconds, the first of Johnston's torpedoes reached Kumano. The cruiser's captain had detected the torpedo tracks and ordered an emergency turn to port, swinging his bow away from the incoming spread. But Johnston's fan pattern was too wide. As Kumano turned, she exposed her entire port side to the torpedo tracks. At 7:32 a.m., 2 torpedoes struck Kumano in quick succession, one forward of the bridge, one just aft of the forward turrets. Each carried a 643-pound warhead of Torpex explosive, 4 times more powerful than TNT. The explosions opened Kumano's hull like a tin can. Her forward magazines flooded. Her bow section collapsed downward at a 30-degree angle. Her speed dropped from 28 knots to 12 knots. then 8 knots as seawater poured into compromised compartments. Kumano fell out of formation, her crew fighting desperately to maintain watertight integrity. She would survive, barely, but she was no longer combat effective. One of Kurita's heavy cruisers was out of the fight, eliminated by a destroyer that by all logic should have been destroyed before launching torpedoes. But Johnston's luck had run out. At 7:33 a.m., a 14-inch shell from Congo struck Johnston's bridge directly. The armor-piercing shell penetrated the thin plating, transited the pilot house, and detonated in the chart room. Commander Evans was standing at the port bridge wing when the explosion hurled him backward. Shrapnel tore through his left hand, severing 2 fingers. More shrapnel opened his torso, chest, and legs. The blast wave ruptured both eardrums. He collapsed on the deck, blood pooling beneath him. The bridge was destroyed. Every man standing in the pilot house was dead or dying. The forward bulkhead had vanished, replaced by a gaping hole open to the sky. Electrical fires burned in the wreckage. Lieutenant Robert Hagan, thrown clear by the blast, pulled himself upright and found Commander Evans lying in the debris. Evans was conscious, his remaining fingers pressed against the wound in his abdomen, his eyes focused despite the pain. "Get aft steering on the line," Evans said quietly. "Continue zigzag. Keep firing. Sir, you need medical. Get aft steering on the line." Hagan grabbed the sound-powered phone and established contact with the manual steering position. Johnston was still moving, down to 17 knots now, but still moving, and her guns were still firing. Commander Ernest Evans would remain in command for another hour and 47 minutes, refusing medical treatment, directing the battle from a half-destroyed bridge as his destroyer fought against impossible odds. But Johnston's sacrifice had bought Taffy 3 precious time. Kumano's elimination and the confusion caused by Johnston's attack had disrupted Kurita's formation. The Japanese fleet had lost its coordination, with individual ships maneuvering independently instead of concentrating fire. It wasn't much, but in a battle where every minute mattered, it was everything. At 7:45 a.m., Admiral Sprague made the decision that would define his career and save thousands of American lives. Watching Johnston's lone attack from Fanshawe Bay's bridge, seeing the torpedo hit on Kumano, and understanding that his carriers could not outrun the Japanese fleet, he transmitted the order that sent his entire destroyer screen into a suicidal charge. Destroyers and destroyer escorts will attack enemy formation. Objective: disrupt their advance and buy time for carrier evacuation. It was a death sentence, and every commanding officer knew it. Aboard the destroyer Hoel, Commander Leon Kindberger acknowledged the order and turned to his executive officer. "Well, this is what we trained for. All ahead flank. Prepare for torpedo attack." Aboard destroyer Heerman, Commander Amos Hathaway issued identical orders. And aboard the destroyer escort Samuel B, Roberts, a ship designed for submarine hunting, not fleet combat, Commander Robert Copeland gathered his officers. "Gentlemen, we're a destroyer escort." Copeland said quietly, "We're not supposed to fight battleships, but today we're going to, and we're going to fight like we're the biggest damn battleship in the fleet." At 7:48 a.m., the 3 destroyers and 4 destroyer escorts increased speed to 30 knots and turned toward the Japanese formation. They formed a loose line, abreast formation, spacing themselves 2,000 yards apart to maximize coverage and prevent a single salvo from hitting multiple ships. The mathematics were even worse than Johnston's attack. 7 small American warships, combined displacement 14,000 tons, were charging 4 Japanese battleships and 6 heavy cruisers with combined displacement exceeding 300,000 tons. The Americans mounted 35 5-inch guns total. The Japanese mounted 97 major caliber guns plus hundreds of secondary batteries, but the Americans had 3 advantages. First, they were small and maneuvering unpredictably, making them difficult targets for long-range optical fire control. Second, They were generating dense smoke screens that broke up Japanese visual tracking. And third, most importantly, they had 21-inch torpedoes that could sink any ship afloat if they reached their targets. Hoel engaged first, targeting the lead battleship, identified correctly as Congo. At 7:51 a.m., closing to 9,000 yards through a storm of incoming fire, Hoel launched all 10 torpedoes in a single spread. The torpedoes ran true, spreading across a 1,500-yard front that forced Congo to turn hard to starboard to avoid them. The turn took Congo out of firing position for 3 precious minutes and disrupted the battleship's firing solution on the carriers. But Hoel paid the price for that success. At 7:53 a.m., an 8-inch shell from heavy cruiser Haguro struck Hoel's forward engine room, killing 19 men and destroying the port turbine. Speed dropped to 20 knots. At 7:54 a.m., a 40-inch shell from Congo, firing in revenge, struck Hoel's aft magazine. The explosion was catastrophic. The entire stern section disintegrated. The aft FI, vinch mount, the aft deckhouse, and 53 men simply ceased to exist. Hoel was dying, but her crew kept fighting. Her 3 remaining FI, inch guns continued firing even as the ship slowed to 10 knots, then 5 knots. At 8:29 a.m., after absorbing 40 direct hits, Hoel rolled onto her port side and sank. Of her crew of 330 men, only 86 survived. Heermann executed her attack run simultaneously with Hoel, approaching from a different angle to split Japanese defensive fire. Commander Hathaway closed to 8,000 yards, so close that Japanese secondary batteries could depress their barrels enough to target the low-profile destroyer, and launched 7 torpedoes at the battleship formation. 1 torpedo struck Haruna aft of her second turret, flooding 2 boiler rooms and reducing her speed to 22 knots. More importantly, Haruna's captain ordered an emergency turn that took the battleship nearly a mile out of formation, opening a gap that the carriers could exploit. Heermann survived her run through sheer luck and brilliant ship handling. Commander Hathaway kept his ship so close to the Japanese formation, at one point passing within 4,000 yards of Haruna, that the battleships couldn't engage without risk of hitting their own vessels with missed shots. Heermann took 11 hits, but all from FI, vinch or smaller caliber weapons. She would survive the battle, barely seaworthy but afloat. The destroyer escorts, smaller, lighter, armed and never designed for surface combat, made their attacks with even more desperate courage. Samuel B. Roberts closed to 5,300 yards, suicidally close, before launching her 3 torpedoes. 1 torpedo struck the heavy cruiser Chokai amidships, detonating in the cruiser's engine room. I lost power, caught fire, and fell out of formation. She would be scuttled later that day by Japanese destroyers after her crew abandoned ship, but Samuel B. Roberts' attack brought her directly under the guns of battleship Congo and heavy cruiser Haguro. At 8:00 a.m., a 14-inch shell struck the destroyer escort's aft gun mount, obliterating the weapon and killing all 40 men in the gun crew. At 8:05 a.m., another 14-inch shell penetrated the forward engine room. The explosion lifted the ship's bow 5 feet out of the water. Her keel broke, her hull began separating into 2 sections. Commander Copeland ordered abandoned ship at 8:10 a.m. Samuel B. Roberts sank at 8:50 a.m., taking 90 men with her. Dennis, John C., Butler, and Raymond executed their torpedo runs with similar courage and similar casualties. Dennis took 6 hits but survived. John C. Butler's torpedoes missed their targets, but her gunfire scored hits on destroyer Yamagumo, setting the Japanese ship on fire. Raymond closed to 6,000 yards despite being targeted by 3 cruisers simultaneously, launched her torpedoes, and somehow escaped with only 4 hits. By 8:30 a.m., the destroyer screen had spent itself. Johnston was dead in the water, still firing with 2 operational guns. Hoel was sinking. Samuel B. Roberts was sinking. Heermann was withdrawing with critical damage. The 4 destroyer escorts had exhausted their torpedoes and were laying smoke to cover the carrier's retreat. But they had achieved their objective. Kurita's formation was disrupted. His ships were scattered across 5 miles of ocean, maneuvering independently, their crews shaken by the ferocity and apparent insanity of the American attacks. And critically, most critically, the carriers had gained 15 minutes of survival time. At 8:25 a.m., with victory literally within gun range, Admiral Takeo Kurita made the most controversial decision in Imperial Japanese Navy history. Standing on Yamato's flag bridge, watching his scattered formation and assessing damage reports from Kumano, Chokai, Suzuya, and multiple other ships, Kurita concluded that he was not facing escort carriers and destroyers. He believed in, correctly but understandably given the ferocity of American resistance, that he had engaged fleet carriers and heavy cruisers from Halsey's Third Fleet. His reasoning was logical from his perspective. Escort carriers didn't fight battleships, they fled, yet these American ships had charged directly at his overwhelming force. His cruisers had taken torpedo hits from spreads that suggested multiple heavy destroyers. His formation had been disrupted by coordinated attacks that demonstrated tactical sophistication far beyond what escort groups typically achieved. And most importantly, where were the American battleships that should be guarding these carriers? Kurita knew American doctrine. Fleet carriers always operated with battleship escorts. If he was engaging what appeared to be fleet carriers, then American battleships must be nearby, perhaps just over the horizon, moving to trap his force against the Samar coast. The idea of a trap was not unreasonable. Kurita had already lost super battleship Musashi to air attacks the previous day. His force was 300 miles from its nearest support. If American battleships caught him here, with his formation scattered and his ships low on fuel and ammunition, he could lose everything. At 8:30 a.m., Kurita transmitted the order that shocked every ship commander in his force. All units break off action, reform to the north, prepare to withdraw through San Bernardino Strait. Aboard the heavy cruiser Tone, Captain Haruo Miyazumi stared at the signal flags in disbelief. The American carriers were right there, visible on the horizon, trailing smoke and clearly damaged. Gambier Bay was dead in the water, surrounded by shell splashes. The other carriers were fleeing at their maximum speed of barely 17 knots. "Admiral is ordering withdrawal," Miyazumi said to his executive officer. "The transports are 15 miles away. We can reach them in 30 minutes. But orders were orders. Tone reversed course, as did Nagato, Haruna, Hagyuro, and the surviving cruisers. Only Yamato continued pursuing for another 10 minutes before Kurita's increasingly urgent signals convinced her captain to break off. Aboard Fanshawe Bay, Admiral Sprague watched the Japanese formation turn away and couldn't believe what he was seeing. His first assumption was that it was a feint, that Kurita would circle around and attack from another angle. He ordered his carriers to maintain flank speed and continue heading southeast, directly away from the Japanese fleet. But the Japanese kept withdrawing. By 9 o'clock a.m. they were hulled down on the horizon. By 9:20 a.m. they were gone. The battle off Samar was over. Against all mathematical probability, against every principle of naval warfare, Taffy 3 had survived. But the price was devastating. Gambier Bay, the escort carrier that had fallen behind the formation after taking early hits, was sinking. She'd absorbed at least 14 8-inch shells and multiple 14-inch hits. Her flight deck was a mass of wreckage. Her engine rooms were flooded. At 9:07 a.m., Captain Walter Vueg ordered abandoned ship. At 9:11 a.m., Gambier Bay rolled onto her side and sank, taking 31 men with her. She remains the only American aircraft carrier sunk by naval gunfire. Johnston, the destroyer that had charged battleships first and alone, was still afloat but barely. With her bridge destroyed, her engines knocked out, and fires burning uncontrollably amidships, Commander Evans finally ordered abandoned ship at 9:45 a.m. Johnston sank at 10:10 a.m. Commander Evans, refusing to abandon his ship, went down with her. His body was never recovered. He was posthumously awarded the Medal of Honor. Hoel sank at 8:29 a.m., as mentioned earlier. Samuel B. Roberts sank at 8:50 a.m. Both ships would receive Presidential Unit citations, the only destroyer escorts in U.S. Navy history to receive that honor. Total American losses: 2 escort carriers sunk, 2 destroyers sunk, 1 destroyer escort sunk, multiple other ships damaged. Total casualties: 1,583 killed, 913 wounded. But Leyte Gulf was safe. The invasion fleet, 60 transport ships carrying supplies and reinforcements for 130,000 troops, was untouched. The Battle of Leyte Gulf ended in complete American victory. Japan's naval power was effectively destroyed, and Taffy III's impossible stand had made it possible. The strategic consequences of the Battle off Samar rippled through the remainder of the Pacific War and into post-war naval doctrine. Admiral Takeo Kurita's decision to withdraw sparked immediate controversy in Japan. When his report reached Imperial General Headquarters, staff officers openly questioned whether he'd suffered mental collapse under pressure. Admiral Somu Toyoda, who'd planned Operation Go, privately told colleagues that Kurita lost his nerve when victory was assured. Japanese historians would debate Kurita's decision for decades. Some defended him, arguing that he acted on incomplete information and made the prudent choice given perceived risks. Others condemned him as the admiral who lost Japan's last opportunity to achieve a decisive victory. Kurita himself never fully explained his reasoning, offering only terse statements in post or interviews that he believed the tactical situation required withdrawal. What's certain is that his scattered formation, his losses to torpedo attacks, and the sheer ferocity of American resistance convinced him he was facing forces far more powerful than he actually was. In military terms, Taffy III achieved strategic deception through tactical desperation, making Kurita believe the impossible situation was something other than what it actually was. The human cost haunted survivors. In the water after Johnston sank, Ensign Robert Billy watched sharks circle the floating survivors. Of Johnston's 327 man crew, only 141 were rescued, many after 3 days in the water. Commander Evans' body was never found, though survivors reported seeing him standing on the fantail as the ship went down, refusing to abandon his command. Samuel B. Roberts lost 90 men from her crew of 178. Many were trapped below decks when the ship broke in half. Others died from injuries during the 3 days they floated in life rafts before rescue ships arrived. Commander Copeland, who survived, spent the rest of his life attending reunions and memorials, telling anyone who would listen about the courage of his crew. Survivors from Gambia Bay faced perhaps the worst ordeal. The carrier sank so quickly that life rafts didn't fully deploy. More than 800 men entered the water, many without life jackets. Sharks attacked within hours. Exposure, dehydration, and injuries killed dozens more. By the time rescue ships arrived 2 days later, only 750 men could be saved, but from that sacrifice emerged lessons that would shape naval warfare for generations. The Battle off Samar proved that small, agile ships with skilled crews could disrupt and potentially defeat much larger opponents through aggressive tactics and coordinated attacks. Modern destroyer doctrine, particularly the emphasis on anti-ship missiles and coordinated saturation, attacks traces directly to the lessons learned off Samar. The battle also demonstrated the critical importance of command determination. Admiral Sprague's decision to order his screen to attack, rather than attempt pure evasion, turned probable annihilation into improbable survival. His tactical flexibility, using smoke, airstrikes, and surface attacks in combination rather than sequentially, maximized his limited resources. And perhaps most importantly, Samar proved that American sailors would fight to the death rather than surrender, even when facing impossible odds. That reputation, earned by men like Ernest Evans, Leon Kintberger, and Robert Copeland, affected Japanese strategic calculations for the remainder of the war. After Leyte Gulf, Japan never again attempted a major surface action. The Imperial Japanese Navy had lost 26 major warships in 4 days of combat, 3 battleships, 4 carriers, 10 cruisers, and 9 destroyers. but more critically, it had lost the institutional confidence that had driven Japanese naval policy since Tsushima in 1905. The victory off Samar didn't just save Leyte Gulf, it broke the Japanese Navy's will to fight. On Memorial Day 1960, President Dwight D. Eisenhower dedicated a monument at Arlington National Cemetery to the men of Taffy 3. The inscription reads simply, "They gave their lives in the most extraordinary example of naval courage in American history." Commander Ernest Evans' Medal of Honor citation, signed by President Roosevelt, states, "For conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity at the risk of his life above and beyond the call of duty as commanding officer of USS Johnston in action against major units of the enemy Japanese fleet during Battle off Samar, the first to lay a smoke screen and to open fire as an enemy task force bore down on our carriers, Commander Evans gallantly diverted the powerful blows of the enemy from the lightly armed and armored carriers under his protection, launching a torpedo attack and maintaining action until Johnston went down, guns firing defiantly to the end. Samuel B. Roberts earned the nickname the destroyer escort that fought like a battleship. Her presidential unit citation remains displayed at the Naval Academy, where each incoming class learns her story during tactical training. Modern destroyer escorts, though now called frigates, carry her legacy in their doctrine and training. Of the 7 ships that charged battleships that morning, only 3 survived the war. Heermann served until 1946. Dennis and John C. Butler served until the early 1950s. All 3 were scrapped, their steel recycled, but their names live on in guided, missile destroyers commissioned decades later. The battle site itself was designated a war grave in 1991. The wreck of Johnston rests at 20,400 feet, the deepest shipwreck ever discovered. Samuel B. Roberts lies at 22,916 feet. Gambier Bay rests at 18,200 feet. All 3 sites are protected under international maritime law, the final resting places of men who proved that courage can overcome mathematics. In 2019, deep sea explorer Victor Vescovo located Johnston's wreck using a specially designed submersible. The footage shows her hull surprisingly intact. Her forward 5-inch gun still pointed defiantly toward where the Japanese fleet once was. Vescovo reported that he could still read the ship's motto, painted on the bridge bulkhead and preserved by the cold oxygen. Free water. Ain't no such thing as halfway loyalty. Ernest Evans would have approved. Military historians study the Battle off Samar for a reason beyond its dramatic narrative. It represents one of the few moments in recorded military history when an outnumbered, outgunned force achieved victory through nothing but determination and tactical brilliance. The mathematics were clear. Taffy 3 should have been destroyed in 20 minutes. Every computer simulation run since the battle produces the same result: total American defeat. The Japanese should have annihilated the carriers, massacred the transports, and potentially changed the entire trajectory of the Pacific War. They didn't, because math can't account for courage. Equations can't calculate what happens when 450 men decide they'd rather die fighting than live as cowards. Simulations can't predict the moment when a destroyer captain decides to charge battleships because it's the right thing to do. Admiral Clifton Sprague, in his after-action report filed 2 weeks after the battle, wrote, "I can only attribute our survival to divine intervention. No other explanation accounts for what we observed that morning." He was wrong. There was another explanation. The men who crewed Johnston Hoel, Samuel B. Roberts, Heermann, Dennis, John C. Butler, and Raymond, the pilots who flew their Wildcats and Avengers into anti-aircraft fire until their fuel ran dry, the damage control parties who fought fires while shells exploded around them, the engineering crews who kept engines running despite flooding and steam ruptures. They're the explanation. Ordinary men who became extraordinary when circumstances demanded it. October 25, 1944, off Samar Island, the day 450 American sailors charged the most powerful fleet ever assembled by Imperial Japan, and won. The day the laws of naval warfare were rewritten by men who refused to accept them. The day that proved courage is its own mathematics. In no engagement in its entire history has the United States Navy shown more gallantry, guts, and gumption than in those 2 morning hours between 7:30 and 9:30 off Samar. Rear Admiral Samuel Eliot Morrison, official U.S. Navy historian,